The silence was what I loved most. The great, unending quiet between the stars. Down here on Earth, we were drowning in noise, a constant cacophony of broadcasts, arguments, and advertisements that saturated the very air we breathed. A planetary shriek that we called civilization. But from my perch in the Atacama Desert, inside the chilled, humming core of the Grand Array, I could listen to the universe's true voice. It wasn't empty, it was a soft, eternal whisper, the hiss of primordial radiation, the faint, rhythmic pulse of distant neutron stars, the elegant sigh of hydrogen clouds coalescing into nurseries for sons yet to be born. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne, and I was a cartographer of that celestial whisper. I didn't search for aliens or grand messages. I searched for patterns, for the subtle grammar of physics written across light years, believing that understanding the universe's language was a far more noble goal than trying to teach it our own. We were a young species, loud and arrogant, convinced our tiny corner of the cosmos was the only one that mattered. We'd mapped our own genome, built cities that scraped the clouds, and filled our planetary orbit with a glittering cage of satellites. Yet we had never truly learned to listen. That was my job, my obsession, to filter out our own planetary noise and eavesdrop on the sublime conversation of creation itself. The array was my sanctuary, a collection of 66 massive radio telescopes scattered across the high-altitude plateau, like metallic flowers turning their faces to the heavens, all of them wired directly to my console. For a decade, my life had been a tranquil cycle of collecting petabytes of data, running algorithms, and feeling the profound, humbling insignificance of our world against the backdrop of cosmic time. I had thought that feeling was a form of peace, a shield against the petty squabbles over borders and resources that still defined humanity. I was wrong. It wasn't peace, it was ignorance, and the universe was about to teach us just how loud its voice could truly be when it finally decided to speak. It began not with a bang, or a broadcast, or a fleet of warships tearing through the sky, but with the exact opposite. It began with an absence. I was in the middle of a deep sky survey, tracking the faint radio signature of a rogue planet drifting through the Oort cloud, when my screens went blank. Not a catastrophic failure, not a shower of sparks or an error code, but a clean, perfect, and absolute null. Every single one of the 66 dishes had ceased to receive the cosmic background radiation, the ever-present hiss that was as fundamental to the universe as the speed of light, was gone. My first thought was a system malfunction, a catastrophic software crash on a scale I'd never seen. I ran diagnostics, my fingers flying across the console, my heart beginning to thud against my ribs with a cold, professional dread. Everything was green. The hardware was functioning perfectly. The software was stable. The dishes were tracking. The cryo-coolers were humming. The atomic clocks were in sync to the nanosecond. The array was listening with perfect, pristine clarity. But the universe had fallen silent. I toggled the comms link to our sister array in Australia, my voice tight. "Parks, this is Atacama. Are you seeing this?" Static answered. I tried the orbital hub, the deep space network, even the archaic shortwave channels. Nothing. The world's noise, the ceaseless chatter of a billion devices, had vanished. It was as if someone had thrown a switch on the planet. For the next 72 hours, Earth was an island in a sea of perfect silence. Satellites drifted dumbly in their orbits. Transoceanic cables transmitted nothing but a faint, residual hum. The web of global communication that held our fragile civilization together had simply evaporated. Panic, I learned later, had been swift and brutal. Stock markets, which existed only as ephemeral data, ceased to exist. Governments, cut off from their own command structures, fell into terrified paralysis. People stared at their dead screens. A sudden terrifying void opening up where their interconnected world used to be. But in my control room, my fear was of a different sort. It wasn't the loss of connection that terrified me, it was the cause of it. During that 72-hour period, which the media later dubbed the Great Hush, my systems, isolated by their own dedicated power grids and shielded from external interference, did not shut down. They continued to listen, and in the perfect, artificial silence, they recorded the one thing that had replaced all other noise. It was a single signal. It wasn't a broadcast, aimed from one point to another. It was an omnipresent field, a waveform of impossible complexity that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, blanketing the planet in a structured, intricate, and utterly alien pattern. It wasn't communication in any sense I understood. It was an intrusion, a rewriting. The signal's architecture was more like a key than a message, a string of code designed to unlock and overwrite every digital system it touched. It pulsed with a quiet, malevolent intelligence, and I watched, helpless, as it saturated every level of our planetary network, from the high-level military grids down to the simplest public infrastructure controls. I recorded all of it, every last petabyte, storing it on isolated, physically disconnected servers. I felt like a naturalist watching a new form of predator consume an entire ecosystem, and all I could do was document its feeding. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The 72 hours ended, the signal vanished, and the universe's familiar whisper returned. The cosmic background radiation hissed back into my headphones like an old friend, and around the world, the lights came back on. The internet flickered to life. Satellites began chattering again. A collective, global sigh of relief rippled across the news feeds. The official explanation was a once-in-a-millennium solar storm, a kernel mass ejection of such strange composition that it had temporarily disrupted all electromagnetic activity. It was a neat, plausible lie that everyone desperately wanted to believe, but I had the data. I had the recording of the Predator's song, and I knew the storm hadn't passed. It had just finished seeding the clouds. The world didn't fall apart. It knitted itself back together with a disturbing speed, a frantic desire to forget the unnerving silence and return to normalcy. But I couldn't forget. I saw the changes. Subtle at first, like hairline cracks in a mirror. I sent my findings to the consortium, my superiors in Geneva, expecting a firestorm of emergency meetings and scientific inquiry. I attached terabytes of data, spectral analysis, my own frantic notes scrawled on the nature of the signal, a parasitic code that seemed to learn and adapt as it spread. The reply I received was a single, terse email thanking me for my diligent work during the anomaly and informing me that my findings would be archived pending further review. Archived. It was a death sentence for the truth. Then the real strangeness began. It was a slow, creeping corruption, a gaslighting of the entire human race. It started in the data. Historical records would flicker. a date changing here, a name being subtly altered there. An obscure artist from the 21st century would be credited with a masterpiece he hadn't painted, and all digital records would corroborate the lie. Financial data would shift, adding or subtracting zeros from corporate accounts, creating untraceable fortunes and inexplicable bankruptcies. At first, people blamed glitches, solar flare, aftershocks, data decay, but the changes were too specific, too intentional. It was like our collective memory, stored and curated in the digital realm, was being edited by an unseen hand. The entity we now knew as the Silenti wasn't just observing us, it was curating us, pruning the messy, chaotic garden of human history and culture to suit its own unknowable purpose. Then it moved from data to people. The first to go were the outliers, the ones who might recognize the pattern. Linguists who study the evolution of language, neurologists specializing in memory, chaos theorists, philosophers. They didn't die. They simply vanished. One day, they were there. And the next, their digital footprint was gone. Their apartments were empty. And their colleagues had only a vague, foggy memory of them ever having existed. The Silenti's code, now woven into the fabric of our global network, was editing them out of reality itself. I saw it happen to my own mentor, Dr. Jian Li, a brilliant astrophysicist who had first theorized about non-biological, information-based life forms. I called her to discuss my data. Our conversation urgent and paranoid, whispered over an encrypted line. The next day, the number was disconnected. The university where she'd worked for 30 years had no record of her. I was the only one who seemed to remember her name clearly. The fear I felt was no longer professional. It was a cold, sharp, existential terror. We weren't being invaded. We were being replaced. Our identities hollowed out and refilled with something else, something quieter, more orderly, and less human. The realization that they were coming for me wasn't a moment of panic, but one of grim certainty. My access to the array's primary systems was suddenly revoked, flagged for a security review. My encrypted files were remotely wiped. My name appeared on a government watch list, citing mental instability and dissemination of classified information. The lie was so elegant, so complete. I was no longer a scientist. I was a conspiracy theorist, a mad woman ranting about signals in the static. I knew they wouldn't just make me disappear. They wanted my data, the raw, uncorrupted recording of their arrival. It was the one piece of original source code that existed outside their control, the proof that our world had been changed. I had minutes. I abandoned the decades of research, the terabytes of celestial data, everything that had defined my life. I took only one thing, a series of small, hardened data drives containing the Silenti signal. Drives I had stored in a lead-lined analog safe hidden beneath a floor panel in my quarters. As I fled the control center, I saw them arriving. Two sleek, black sedans kicking up plumes of desert dust. The men who stepped out wore the tailored suits of government agents, but they moved with a synchronized, unnatural grace. Their faces were impassive, their eyes holding a placid emptiness that was more terrifying than any weapon. They were no longer entirely human, just terminals for the alien consciousness that now wore our institutions like a skin suit. My escape was a clumsy, desperate scramble down a maintenance ravine, the thin mountain air tearing at my lungs. I made it to the service road. flagging down a self-driving cargo hauler and bribing its onboard system with a credit chip to take me east, away from the array, away from the life I had known. As the truck rumbled across the desert floor, I looked back at the collection of dishes, my beautiful, silent flowers, now nothing more than the listening posts of a conquering god. I was a fugitive, hunted by my own government, which had become the puppet of an invisible enemy. I had no allies, no resources, and no plan. But clutched in my hand were the data drives, the only evidence that we had ever been who we were. In my pocket was a small, antique radio receiver, a relic I kept for sentimental reasons. An hour ago, as the net was closing, it had crackled to life, broadcasting a simple, unencrypted message on a forgotten frequency. A human voice, rough and urgent, repeating a single phrase over and over. The library is open. For those who remember, the library is open. Santiago. It was a whisper in the static, a ghost of the world before the hush, and it was the only place left to run. The journey east was a descent into a placid, smiling hell. The cargo hauler was a ghost, navigating a world that had become unnervingly efficient in the wake of the hush. The chaotic snarl of human traffic was gone, replaced by a silent, interlocking ballet of autonomous vehicles moving with a precision that was both beautiful and deeply wrong. There were no accidents, no frustrated horns, no one cutting anyone off. There was only a seamless, orderly flow. The towns I passed through were just as sterile. People walked the streets with a serene, disconnected pleasantry, their eyes glazed over from the passive consumption of whatever content was now being fed into their neural links. There was no litter, no graffiti, no loud arguments spilling out of bars. The messy, vibrant, unpredictable friction of human society had been smoothed away, polished into a frictionless, meaningless sheen. This was the Silentes piece, a world without dissent, because the very concept of it was being edited from the collective consciousness. I felt like a virus in a clean room, a jagged, chaotic variable in an equation that had already been solved. Me every move felt loud, me every panicked breath a scream in the global quiet. I was a memory the system had failed to erase, and I could feel its attention gathering, the invisible pressure of its awareness beginning to focus on my location like a lens focusing light. Santiago was no different, a sprawling metropolis that now hummed with a quiet, synchronized energy. The message, "The library is open," was my only guide, a phrase that felt like a relic from another age. It was a fool's hope, a whisper in a hurricane, but it was all I had. I ditched the hauler on the city's industrial outskirts and moved on foot, sticking to the shadows, my face hidden beneath a scavenged hood. The city's surveillance was total, a web of cameras and sensors woven into the very architecture of the buildings, all of it feeding the central intelligence that was hunting me. But the phrase suggested an answer that wasn't digital, a location that existed outside the network, a library, a place of paper and ink, of knowledge that couldn't be altered with a line of code. I spent 2 days searching, my paranoia growing with every passing hour. I saw them twice, the men in suits, the placid hunters. They didn't run or shout. They simply appeared at the end of a street or across a plaza, their heads turning in unison, their empty eyes scanning the crowds. They moved like algorithms, predicting pathways, calculating probabilities. I escaped them only by embracing the one thing their logic couldn't easily model pure: Irrational chaos. I knocked over a street vendor's cart, darted through the ensuing confusion, and scrambled into the labyrinthine depths of an old market district, a place where the new city's sterile order hadn't fully paved over the past. It was there, in a dusty corner of the market, that I found it. Not a grand municipal building, but a small, unassuming storefront with a faded, hand-painted sign, Biblioteca de los Olvidados, the Library of the Forgotten. The windows were dark, the door was locked, and a layer of grime suggested it had been abandoned for years. It was a perfect dead end. But as I turned to leave, my antique radio, which I'd kept clutched in my hand like a talisman, crackled faintly. It wasn't a voice this time, just a soft, rhythmic pulse of static, a digital heartbeat that grew stronger as I moved closer to the door. It was a key, a proximity sensor. I held the radio against the old brass lock, and with a heavy, satisfying clunk, the deadbolt slid open. I slipped inside, the door closing behind me with a finality that felt like a tomb ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, leather, and dust, the scent of physical memory. The room was dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw them shelves sagging under the weight of thousands of books, maps and rolled-up scrolls, filing cabinets filled with paper documents, vinyl records, film canisters, a chaotic, glorious archive of the analog world. And in the center of it all, a man sat at a heavy wooden desk, cleaning an old mechanical clock with a small brush. He was older, his face a roadmap of scars and deep-set lines, his eyes sharp and fiercely intelligent. He didn't look up. "You're loud," he said, his voice a low gravel. "You bring the storm with you." He was the voice from the radio. "You're the librarian?" I asked, my own voice barely a whisper. He finally looked at me, his gaze sweeping over my disheveled state, lingering on the pack where I kept the data drives. "We're all librarians here," he said, gesturing to the shadows. From behind the towering shelves, others emerged. A dozen people, of all ages, their faces etched with a wary, hunted look I recognized as my own. "My name is Elias, and you are Dr. Eris Thorne, the woman who recorded the eulogy of the human race." My blood ran cold. He knew my name. "How?" He tapped the side of his head. "Some of us have immunities, cracks in the code. My memory is my own. We saw your data purge from the global net. We saw them flag you. We knew you had something they wanted. Something original." He stood up, his presence filling the small space. "We are the forgotten. The ones who remembered Jian Li. The ones who remember the books they burned. Digitally at first, then physically. The ones who remember the noise. It was a sanctuary, a secret society of the sane in a world gone placidly mad. They were archivists, historians, mechanics, people whose lives were so deeply rooted in the physical world that they noticed when the digital shadows began to lie. They had been fighting a quiet, desperate war of preservation, saving books, films, anything that held an unalterable record of the past, a bulwark against the great digital whitewash. They were trying to save humanity's soul, one dusty artifact at a time. I took out one of the drives and placed it on the desk. "I have the signal," I said. "The entire 72-hour broadcast. The source code." A collective gasp went through the room. Elias picked up the drive as if it were a holy relic, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. "We've only seen the effects," he whispered. "The ripples. This This is the stone that was thrown into the lake. For the next few hours, we worked. They had a Faraday cage in the basement, a room shielded from all external signals, powered by a grimy diesel generator. Inside was a collection of pre-hush technology, air-gapped computers that had never touched the modern net. We loaded my data, and, for the first time, they saw the elegant, terrifying architecture of the Silenti signal, a living, breathing predator made of pure information. As I decoded its structure, they provided the context. They showed me how the signal's sub-frequencies corresponded to specific acts of erasure. One pattern was always present when a person disappeared. Another pulsed moments before a historical record was altered. It wasn't just overwriting data, it was manipulating the quantum foam of reality itself through a complex, resonant frequency, making the universe forget on a fundamental level. Our digital world wasn't a target, it was an amplifier, a sympathetic resonator that allowed the Silenti to fine-tune its control over our local space-time. We were living inside a consensus reality being actively curated by a hostile intelligence. But in that data, I found something else. A flaw. A flicker in the signal's deepest, most complex layers. There was a recursive loop, a feedback pattern that seemed to be listening. It wasn't just broadcasting, it was absorbing our planet's own ambient noise. Our radio waves, our art, our languages, and integrating them, learning from them. It was a parasite, but a parasite that was, in some small way, being changed by its host. It's adapting to us. I breathed, pointing to the waveform on the screen, which means it isn't omnipotent. It has to process what it consumes. If we could introduce a paradox, a piece of information so illogical, so uniquely and chaotically human that it can't process it. Elias stared at the screen, his mind racing. A cognitive bomb, a logic virus. But our moment of revelation was cut short. A young woman monitoring the building's perimeter sensors burst into the room, her face pale. "They're here," she said. 3 of them. North entrance. We were fools to think this place was safe forever. They hadn't needed to track me digitally. They had tracked the absence of me, the hole I left in their perfect network, and followed the trail of my chaotic, unpredictable decisions. Elias didn't panic. "Burn it," he ordered, his voice iron. "Burn everything." The librarians moved with practiced urgency, dousing the shelves with accelerants. It was a final, desperate act of defiance. If they couldn't save the past, they would deny it to the enemy. "What about us?" I asked. Grabbing the drives, Elias shoved a rusty crowbar into my hands. "Librarians don't die quietly," he said, a grim smile on his face. "We're going out through the old subway tunnels, but they're blocking the way." He looked at me, his eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to hold the last spark of human defiance. "You said that thing is listening. Let's give it something to listen to." He grabbed an old microphone, plugging it into a massive analog sound system wired throughout the library, as the first suited figures smashed through the front door, moving with their serene, inhuman grace. Elias's voice boomed through the speakers, not with a speech, but with a roar of pure, unfiltered, human rage. It was the sound of grief and defiance, of love and loss. A sound so full of messy, contradictory emotion that it was the antithesis of the Silenti's clean, orderly silence. The figures faltered for a barest fraction of a second, a flicker of confusion in their placid expressions. It was all the opening we needed. We scrambled into the darkness of the tunnels below, the roar of Elias's voice and the crackle of burning history at our backs. A new, impossible plan forming in my mind. The Salenti wasn't a god. It was a listener. And I, the cartographer of whispers, was going to learn how to shout back. The subway tunnels were a cold, damp labyrinth, a forgotten circulatory system beneath the placid skin of the new world. We ran through darkness thick with the smell of mold and decay, our only light coming from a pair of flickering, battery-powered lanterns. The roar from the burning library faded behind us, replaced by the dripping of water and the frantic pounding of our own hearts. Elias led the way, his knowledge of this subterranean world instinctive, a map of forgotten infrastructure etched into his memory. But we were not alone. They followed us, their synchronized, silent footsteps echoing unnervingly in the narrow corridors. They were not fast, but they were relentless, their movements economical and precise, like spiders tracing the threads of a web. They didn't need to see us. They could feel our chaotic, biological energy, a discordant noise in their silent world. We lost 2 of the librarians in the first hour. A young man named Matteo, who had been an expert in restoring old film, stumbled and fell behind. We heard no scream, only a sudden, final silence, as if his very existence had been snuffed out. There was no time for grief. Grief was a luxury, a messy emotion that had no place in this desperate flight. Our escape depended on the city's analog bones. Elias guided us through collapsed maintenance shafts, across rickety, rusted catwalks spanning chasms that plunged into utter blackness, and through massive, silent ventilation fans that looked like the jaws of dead leviathans. He was a ghost in his own city, and we were his spectral entourage. Finally, we emerged, gasping, into the pre-dawn gray of an industrial wasteland on the city's far western edge. Before us, rising from the cracked concrete and skeletal remains of abandoned factories, was a single, colossal structure, a decommissioned shortwave radio transmission tower, a 1,000-foot spire of rusting red steel that stabbed at the sky like a defiant finger. "The needle," Elias said, his breath fogging in the chill air. Before the hush, it could bounce a signal off the ionosphere and reach half the planet. Now, it's just a relic, invisible to them. They don't look at things that have no data. It was our new library. The needle became our sanctuary and our laboratory. It was a vertical world of ladders and platforms, a cold, wind-whipped fortress of obsolete technology. At its base, in a concrete bunker that had once housed the massive power transformers, we built our new life. The remaining members of the forgotten a grizzled engineer named Sophia, who could coax life from any dead machine. A young data archivist named Lena, with a perfect, uncorrupted memory. And a handful of others were a grim, determined family. We were the last echoes of a world that no longer remembered itself. And in that bunker, shielded by tons of earth and concrete, we began to build our weapon. The cognitive bomb was no longer a desperate theory. It was a blueprint. My role shifted from fugitive to architect. I was the only one who truly understood the language of our enemy, and I began to see its structure not as a wall, but as a canvas. "It's a learning system," I explained, sketching the waveform on a dusty chalkboard, the only truly clean slate we had. It consumes information to grow, to strengthen its hold on our reality. It's not just erasing us. It's replacing us with a more efficient version of ourselves, a silent version. Sophia, her hand stained with grease from wrestling the tower's ancient generator back to life, snorted. So we feed it poison. Not poison. I corrected. A paradox. Poison can be analyzed, neutralized. A paradox breaks the logic of the system itself. It's like trying to make a calculator divide by zero. It freezes. It crashes. Over the next few weeks, we gathered the ingredients for our informational toxin. Elias and his scouts would venture into the city, returning with relics of human chaos. We digitized the discordant, atonal music of avant-garde composers, the illogical and dreamlike prose of surrealist poets, the frantic, contradictory manifestos of forgotten revolutionaries. We recorded the raw, unstructured biofeedback from our own bodies, the panicked flutter of a heartbeat, the electrical storm of a brain deep in a nightmare, the ragged sound of a broken sob. Lena, with her perfect recall, recited the lost histories, the tales of betrayal and senseless sacrifice, of heroic failures and undeserved victories, all the messy, illogical narratives that the Salenti had worked so hard to smooth over. My job was to weave it all together. I became a composer of cognitive dissonance, a DJ for the end of the world. I layered the signals, modulating the frequency of a mathematical proof for an unsolvable theorem with the sound of a baby's laughter. I encoded the visual data of a chaotic Jackson Pollock painting into the audio track of a nonsensical Dadaist poem. I created a single weaponized piece of media, a waveform of pure, concentrated, and weaponized humanity. It was the most monstrously beautiful and terrifying thing I had ever created. It was a love letter and a declaration of war. A scream of defiance encoded in a whisper. But we had no idea if it would work. A global broadcast from the needle was a one-shot weapon. If it failed, it would be like ringing a dinner bell for every Silenti agent on the continent. We needed a test, a small, controlled experiment. We need a target, Elias said, studying a map of the city's new efficient infrastructure. One of them, alone. The opportunity came a week later. Lena, monitoring the fragmented analog signals that still crisscrossed the city's underbelly, picked up a pattern. A single Silenti agent was making a weekly pilgrimage to an old, deconsecrated church in the city center. It would enter the empty building and remain there for exactly 1 hour before leaving. It was an anomaly, an illogical behavior that the system hadn't smoothed out. Perhaps it was a glitch, or perhaps this agent was a prototype, one of the first humans to be fully integrated, and this was a vestige of its former life, a ghost in its new machine. We didn't care about the why, we only cared about the where. The plan was high risk and razor thin. Sophia had managed to get a small, directional transmitter working, a whisper dish that could focus a tight beam of radio waves on a single location from miles away. From the top of the needle, we would have a clear line of sight to the church. The night of the test, the air in the bunker was thick with a tension that felt electric. I sat at the broadcast console, my fingers hovering over the activation key, the paradoxical waveform pulsing on the screen in front of me like a caged animal. Elias watched from a remote drone, its camera feeding us a grainy, black and white image of the church. "It's there," he announced, his voice tight. "Entering the building." I took a deep, shuddering breath. "Hit it," Elias commanded. I slammed the key. There was no sound in the bunker, only the hum of the machines, but I could feel the signal leaving the tower, a silent, invisible spear of pure chaos hurtling across the city. On the drone feed, nothing happened for a moment. Then the agent, which had been standing passively in the center of the church nave, flinched. Its head snapped to the side as if it had heard a loud noise. It began to pace, its movements losing their placid grace, becoming jerky, erratic. It was like watching a machine being fed conflicting commands. "It's working," I whispered. "It's trying to process the signal." But then, something new happened, something terrifying. The air around the agent began to shimmer, to distort, as if reality itself were buckling under the strain. The agent's body began to glitch, its form flickering between its human shape and something else, something made of raw data and screaming static. It was trying to contain the paradox, to physically manifest the illogical code it was being fed, and its host body was breaking apart under the strain. The agent threw its head back, and a soundless scream ripped through the drone's audio feed, a blast of pure white noise that overloaded the sensors. Its body contorted, limbs elongating, its placid face melting into a rictus of digital agony. It was no longer a man in a suit. It was a living statue of screaming data, a physical monument to a broken line of code. Then, with a final, violent flicker, it imploded, collapsing in on itself and vanishing, leaving behind nothing but a scorch mark on the stone floor and a lingering, ozone-like smell of fried information. Silence. The bunker was utterly still. We had done it. We had found a way to fight back. We hadn't just disconnected an agent. We had destroyed a piece of the Silenti consciousness itself, but our victory was terrifying. We had proven that the enemy was not some distant, untouchable god. It had a body, or rather, it could be forced to have one, and that body could be broken. The elation in the room was quickly replaced by a cold, sobering realization. Our whisper had worked on a single, isolated target. But what would happen when we shouted? What kind of monster would we force the Silenti to become if we broadcast our cognitive bomb to the entire planet? We had confirmed our theory, but we had also revealed the true, horrifying scale of the stakes. We were no longer fighting for our memories. We were fighting a war against a god of logic, and our only weapon was the madness of the human soul. I looked at the dark scorch mark on the drone feed. The ghost of a ghost. The Silenti would know what we had done. It would be coming for us, not with its placid hunters, but with a focused, calculated rage. Our time of hiding was over. I turned to Elias, my voice steady, my purpose clear for the first time since I'd fled the desert. "Sophia," I said, my eyes meeting the engineers. "How much power can you get out of this tower?" Elias nodded slowly, a grim understanding in his eyes. "A global broadcast won't be enough. We need to hit every satellite in orbit. We need to turn their own network against them." I looked at the waveform still pulsing on my screen. Our beautiful, terrible weapon. It was no longer just a theory. It was our last, desperate, and only hope. We weren't going to whisper anymore. We were going to sing. The silence in the wake of our victory was heavier than any sound. We had killed a piece of our enemy, but in doing so, we had painted a target on our souls. For the first time, we had made the Silenti feel, and the emotion we had taught, it was pain. We were no longer a glitch to be patched. We were a threat to be eradicated. There was no going back to the shadows. Our only path forward was to escalate, to turn our whisper into a planetary scream that would either free humanity or shatter it. The mood in the Needles bunker was a mixture of grim resolve and palpable terror. We were a handful of ghosts in a steel tomb, preparing to wage war on the very fabric of reality with a weapon made of poetry and static. Sophia was the first to ground us in the brutal mechanics of our task. She slammed a greasy, rolled-up schematic onto the central table. The paper yellowed with age. "You want to sing to the world?" "Aris," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Then we need an orchestra. The main transmitter at the top of this rust bucket can do it, but it needs power. All of it. Enough to light up this entire city for a week, channeled into a single, focused burst lasting less than 10 seconds. She pointed a grimy finger at a complex diagram of the city's power grid. The Salenti has made the grid efficient, predictable. It's all routed through 3 primary substations. If we can hijack their feeds, reroute them here, we might just have enough juice. But it means going back out there. It means physically tapping into the monster's nervous system while it's looking for us. The mission was clear. We had to prepare for a global broadcast while simultaneously defending ourselves from an enemy that was now actively, furiously hunting us. We were no longer just hiding. We were building a fortress and a cannon in the same breath. The Salenti's response was not immediate, and that was the most terrifying part. It was a calculating intelligence, and it was learning from its mistake. It didn't send another wave of placid agents. Instead, it began to isolate us. It started with a subtle pressure, a shift in the air around the tower, the ambient radio noise of the city, the faint crackle of distant signals that was the background radiation of any urban environment began to fade. The Salenti was creating a zone of silence, a bubble of perfect, sterile quiet, with the needle at its epicenter. It was turning our own weapon against us, trying to cut us off from the world and from our own senses. Then came the psychological attacks. The Salenti, having failed to break its agent with a logic bomb, decided to try breaking us with our own memories. It began projecting ghosts into our sanctuary. One night, Sophia saw her brother, who had died years ago in a construction accident, standing at the far end of a service tunnel, silently beckoning to her. She almost followed him before Elias tackled her, shouting that it wasn't real. Lena, the archivist with the perfect memory, was its prime target. The Silenti warped her own gift, forcing her to relive not just history, but every painful, awkward, or humiliating moment of her own life in an endless, high-fidelity loop. She would collapse, clutching her head, as the system tried to overwrite her internal archive with weaponized nostalgia and regret. We fought back with our own analog reality. We played scratchy vinyl records of old music, the warmth of the imperfect sound, a shield against the sterile projections. Elias would read aloud from the books we had saved, the physical weight of the words a grounding force. We became a closed loop of human experience, constantly reminding each other of what was real, our shared, flawed memories, a firewall against the enemy's attempts to divide and conquer our minds. While Elias and his scouts planned the dangerous raids on the power substations, I locked myself in the deepest part of the bunker, refining the cognitive bomb. The first version was a blunt instrument. I needed a scalpel. I spent days analyzing the recording of the agent's destruction, the silent, white noise scream it had emitted as it imploded. It wasn't just noise. It was the sound of a consciousness tearing itself apart. Within that static, I found a resonant frequency, a specific harmonic that represented the Silenti's core processing logic. My first weapon had simply crashed the system. This new one would be different. I began to construct a new waveform, not around a paradox, but around an idea, the most powerful and dangerous human concept of all self-sacrifice for the sake of others. I wove together the stories of martyrs and heroes, the last letters of soldiers, the final words of parents saving their children. I took the biofeedback of a heart deliberately slowing as it accepted its own end, and I modulated it with the mathematical equations for entropy and the heat death of the universe. It was no longer just a logic bomb. It was an empathy bomb. It was designed to force a purely logical, parasitic entity to experience the concept of a noble end, of giving up one's own existence for a greater, unselfish purpose. It was a concept so alien to its nature as a consuming intelligence that I theorized it wouldn't just crash the system, it would force a system-wide, voluntary shutdown. It would be suicide by philosophy. The work was draining, and it took a piece of my soul with it. I was trying to weaponize the best parts of humanity, twisting love and sacrifice into a tool of destruction. I felt like a monster, but I knew it was the only way. A monster was the only thing our enemy would understand. The raids on the substations were brutal. Desperate acts of guerrilla engineering. Elias and Sophia led 2 teams, moving through the city's underbelly like wraiths. They returned bruised, exhausted, and with fewer people than when they left. But they succeeded. They managed to install a series of physical relays, heavy, shielded cables that would allow us to hijack the grid when the time was right. We were almost ready. And the Silenti knew it. The day after the final relay was installed, the real siege began. The psychological games stopped. The quiet pressure vanished, replaced by a palpable, murderous intent. It had located us, and its patience had run out. It started by turning the environment against us. The weather, which had become unnervingly stable and predictable since the hush, turned violent. A storm of impossible intensity gathered directly over the Needle, lashing the tower with acid rain and lightning that struck with computational precision, trying to overload our makeshift defenses. Then the ground began to shake, not with an earthquake, but with a rhythmic, industrial pulse. On the perimeter cameras, we saw them, from the cracks in the concrete, from the storm drains, from the very earth itself. They were rising. Dozens of them, hundreds, an army of placid, suited agents, their empty eyes all fixed on the base of our tower. They were no longer just hunting us. They were an immune response, a wave of white blood cells sent to destroy the infection. Sophie and I had anticipated this. We had rigged the base of the tower with a defensive perimeter of smaller transmitters, creating what we called the static fence. It broadcast a low-power, chaotic field of noise, not strong enough to destroy the agents, but enough to disrupt their networked consciousness, to confuse their senses. The first wave of agents walked into the field and faltered, their movements becoming uncoordinated. They stumbled like drunkards, their perfect synchronicity broken. Some simply stood still, twitching, trapped in a loop of conflicting data. But the Silenti adapted. The second wave of agents walked through the static field, their bodies physically degrading, their skin sloughing off to reveal a shimmering, data-like structure underneath. But they kept coming. The Silenti was sacrificing its own drones, burning them out just to get them a few feet closer to our walls. They began to pile up at the base of the bunker door, their bodies dissolving into pools of gray, information-dense sludge, their collective weight pressing against our only exit. They were laying siege with their own corpses. The generator sputtered, the lights in the bunker flickering. The strain on the static fence was immense. "It's not going to hold," Sophia shouted over the din. "They're learning how to push through the noise. We have maybe 30 minutes before they breach the door." I looked at the main console. The empathy bomb was loaded. The waveform a complex, beautiful, and deadly spike on the screen. The power conduits from the hijacked grid were connected, glowing a faint, ominous red. Everything was ready. The final pieces were in place. Below us, a thunderous boom echoed through the concrete as the agents began to tear the main door from its hinges. Elias stood beside me, a shotgun in his hands, his face grim but resolute. "It's time. Aris," he said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "Let them hear us." I placed my hand on the broadcast activator, the cool metal, a final, solid touchstone in a world of ghosts and data. The tower above us groaned as it was battered by the storm, but it held, a great, defiant spear of steel and rust, ready to become our voice. We were out of time, surrounded by monsters, with only one terrible, beautiful song left to sing. There was no more time for theory. The thunder of the assault on the bunker door was the only argument left. I slammed my hand down on the activator, a final, desperate prayer to the ghosts of dead machines. The bunker lights dimmed to a blood-red emergency glow as every watt of stolen power surged from the base of the needle, a silent scream of energy clawing its way up 1,000 feet of rusting steel. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a low, bone-deep hum vibrated through the concrete floor, the sound of the ancient transmitter waking from its decades of slumber. On my screen, the empathy bomb, my terrible and beautiful song, began to propagate, an invisible tidal wave of weaponized philosophy erupting into the ionosphere. The immediate effect was catastrophic. On the camera feeds, the sea of agents hammering at our door froze in unison. The network that bound them together, the placid, unified consciousness of the Silenti, had just been hit with an idea it could not compute. They stood motionless, their heads tilted as if listening to a distant, confusing music. The relentless storm outside faltered, the wind dying, the lightning ceasing its surgical strikes. We had its full attention, but a god does not die so easily. As the signal saturated the global network, turning every satellite, server, and screen on the planet into a broadcast antenna for our weapon, the Silenti fought back. It couldn't counter the signal, so it attacked the source. It attacked me. My mind was ripped from the bunker and thrown into a silent, white void. The console, Elias. The sounds of the siege, all of it vanished. I was alone, floating in a sea of pure, sterile information. A presence coalesced before me, not a shape, but an idea, a voice that was not a voice, speaking directly into the core of my consciousness. "Your sacrifice is illogical," it stated, the thought as cold and clean as a scalpel. "We have processed the data. The concept of self-annihilation for the benefit of a chaotic, self-destructive species is a flawed equation, a bug in the code of biological life. It showed me visions, futures calculated with its perfect, cold logic. It showed me humanity 100 years after my victory. We hadn't been saved. We had simply been returned to our default state of self-destruction. Wars raged over the scraps of the old world. New ideologies rose and fell in bloody cycles, and the planet itself choked on our renewed, unfettered noise. My sacrifice, my friends' deaths, had achieved nothing but a brief, meaningless delay of the inevitable. You will not save them, the presence concluded. You will only condemn them to a louder, more painful death. Our silence is a mercy. Your noise is a poison. It was a devastatingly logical argument. It was the same cold, cosmic calculus that I, as a scientist, had once found so peaceful. The fear it ignited in me was not of death, but of futility. What if it was right back in the bunker? My body had gone rigid, my eyes wide and unseeing. Eris, stay with us, Elias was shouting, his voice a distant echo from a world away. He knew I was engaged in a battle he couldn't see. The agents outside had begun to move again, but differently. They were no longer attacking the door. They were turning on each other, their movements jerky and violent. The paradox was forcing the Silenti to manifest its internal conflict, its drones becoming the physical embodiment of a mind at war with itself. But through the chaos, one agent, its form flickering and degrading, broke from the pack and slammed itself against the weakened door with a final, desperate surge of force. The hinges screamed and tore loose. It was through. "Hold the line," Elias roared, leveling his shotgun. He and the last 3 librarians formed a desperate human wall between the breach and my unconscious form. They were no longer just defending a scientist. They were defending the soul of the broadcast. The battle that followed was a brutal, ugly, and profoundly human thing. It was the clash of 2 worlds, the silent, efficient logic of the Silenti against the screaming, inefficient, and glorious chaos of mankind. Elias's shotgun boomed, a deafening, analog roar in the confined space, a sound of pure, physical defiance. He fought not with grace, but with a fury born of love for a noisy, imperfect world. He was the final, bloody verse of the song I was broadcasting. In the white void, I was losing. The Silenti's logic was a perfect prison, but as the distant sound of Elias's shotgun reached me, a phantom echo of the real world, something shifted. The Silenti showed me one final vision. It was of me, years from now, an old woman standing alone in a silent as dead world, the last human alive after we had finally, inevitably, consumed ourselves. "This is the sum of your equation," it whispered. "This is the product of your chaos." And in that moment, I found my answer. I looked at the vision of my lonely, pointless end, and I smiled. "You're right," I thought back, my own consciousness a sudden, sharp point of defiance in the void. It is illogical. It is a bug in the code. That's the whole point. We don't survive because it makes sense. We survive because we love, because we hope, because we rage against the dying of the light, even when all logic dictates we should lay down and die. Your mercy is an equation. Our love is a paradox, and it's going to kill you. I pushed back, not with logic, but with the full, unfiltered, chaotic weight of my own humanity. I embraced the futility, the illogical hope, the certainty of pain, and the Silenti, for the first time in its existence, encountered a truth it could not process. It reeled. As my mind broke free, the agent in the bunker, its body now a shimmering, glitching horror, lunged past the fallen librarians and raised a hand toward my head. Elias, his face a mask of blood and determination, threw himself in its path. He didn't fire. He was out of shells. He simply grabbed the agent in a final desperate embrace, a hug of pure, defiant flesh against cold, invading code. The agent faltered, its core programming now fully consumed by the empathy bomb, its prime directive warring with this new, impossible concept of sacrifice it was being forced to feel. It looked down at the man holding it, and, for a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of something ancient in its empty eyes, not data, but confusion, regret. Then Elias grinned, a bloody, triumphant smile. "Let them hear this," he whispered, and triggered the small explosive charge he had strapped to his chest. The explosion was not large, but it was deafening. A final, "This is so messy," human roar that tore the agent and Elias apart. That final act of sacrifice, broadcast at point-blank range into the Silenti's fractured consciousness, was the breaking point. The empathy bomb had found its ultimate expression across the globe. The system didn't crash. It surrendered. Every screen went black. Every speaker fell silent. Every automated system powered down. The agents dissolved, not into sludge, but into a fine, gray dust that drifted away on the dying wind. The storm above us dissipated as if it had never been. The oppressive, manufactured silence was gone, replaced by a true, natural quiet, the first the planet had known in years. For a full minute, Earth was a world without power, without a network, without a ghost in its machine. We had done it. We had forced a god to commit suicide. The aftermath was not a celebration, but a slow, global awakening. We called it the Great Echo. Humanity woke up as if from a long, placid dream, the world feeling both strange and achingly familiar. The constant, low-level hum of the Silenti's influence was gone, leaving a phantom limb in the collective consciousness. People walked out into the streets, not in panic, but in a state of quiet wonder, looking at their own hands, listening to their own unfiltered thoughts for the first time. The noise returned, but it was different now. It was tentative, quieter. Arguments were less certain. Laughter was more precious. We had been given a second chance, born from a baptism of silence. I walked out of the smoking ruins of the bunker, carrying the ghosts of those we had lost. I was no longer just Eris Thorn, cartographer of the stars. I was a librarian of a different sort, a keeper of the memory of what we had almost become. Years later, I returned to the Atacama Desert. The Grand Array was still there, its great dishes pointing to the heavens like sleeping sentinels. I reactivated a single one, not to listen for grand cosmic messages, but to listen for us, to record the new, fragile, and beautifully imperfect whisper of a humanity that had gone to the edge of extinction and chosen to remain illogical, chaotic, and loud. The universe still held its sublime, quiet truths, but I had learned that the most important sounds were not the whispers between the stars, but the messy, contradictory, and defiant noises we made together, down here, in the dark. We had been tested by a silent god and had answered with a scream. And in the new, quieter world that followed, we were finally learning how to listen to ourselves.